Okay, it says we're live. I'm going to go do my posts. So that should go out good. And there we go with posts. And there may or may not be anybody ready to listen. So we'll give folks a couple minutes to join. In the meantime, I'll check on another computer here to be really sure in my paranoid way that everything really is actually working. And we'll see if anyone turns up. It's entirely possible no one will turn up. Who knows? We'll see. These things happen. So actually finding me is hard. Maybe I can go over here. There I am. It says I'm live. Okay, and there we are. And I'm looking off to the side, and that's good. And I should be able to see when people join. But I never remember where that is, and they always love to change these things around a little bit. So we'll see. But YouTube is working. We'll check Facebook quickly. Who knows? If we wind up just being a podcast with no listeners, with no current live folks, that'll be fine, because we'll talk about that. And there we are on the screen. So that's actually working. Good stuff. We'll give them another minute maybe to show up, and then we'll actually get started, whether or not anyone is here. In theory, I'm supposed to be able to see how many people are watching on each platform, but I'm not sure where to look. I never know. It's a mystery. Could be millions of people listening to us right this moment.
Yeah, could be, couldn't it?
You never know.
You never know.
We'll give them another few seconds. I feel I should have something really entertaining to do in this dead air, but I don't have it. Okay, well, let's get started. So welcome to everybody who's here and people watching later on recording. I'm Squirrel. That is actually my name. I'm for those of you who don't know me, and many of you will, but many of you won't. I'm a consulting CTO. That means I work with loads of different companies. The number is up like 102 in the last 6 years, something like that. So I work with lots and lots of different organizations, all different sizes, all different industries, and I help them with all kinds of interesting problems. And I recently wrote a book with my good friend Jeffrey Frederick called Agile Conversations. You can find out about that on the website for the book, which is agileconversations.com or conversationaltransformation.com. We had to buy this domain name off somebody, so we had to get a separate domain name that could actually go in the book. And Jamie's going to introduce himself in a minute, but he's going to he wants to ask me some questions. And when people ask me questions these days, what I say is, let's live stream it. So then people can see and they can join in and tell me I'm all wet and other things. And rather than me just writing back to Jamie, I thought, let's get on and do a live stream. So he's going to ask me about the tilted slider, which I have here in the book, and I'll do a very complicated visual effect of holding up the book, and we'll talk about what it is. But Jamie, do you want to tell us who you are, where you came from, why you're asking me this question? Just a little bit of intro about you.
Sure. So I'm Jamie Collins. I'm based in the UK. I work as this Agile coach, Scrum Master, Scrum professional, and working with transformational leadership. My phone is, of course, going off because I'm put on Do Not Disturb live TV.
That's how it goes. We're all used to that. My dog will bark. Don't worry. It's fine.
And and helping organizations be awesome. And so also I listen, I'm the type of Agile professional that likes to read lots of books, read lots of blogs, always following people on Twitter to find out about new ideas, and of course listening to podcasts. And really enjoy listening to one of my favorite ones, Troubleshooting Agile.
Well, thank you.
Which yourself, Squirrel, and Jeffrey are the.
Indeed. So I think you heard us talking about the tilted slider. Let me just show it here. Let's see if we can actually make it visible. I haven't experimented with this. I don't know if it'll really work, but if I find the camera first, that would be really effective. It does seem to be coming out the right way round. Should I explain it, or would you like to, Jamie? Which of us should do it? I'm happy either way.
Well, I'll just give my take on it because
please, I'd be interested to see what you think.
I didn't have the advantage of seeing it. I just had to try and recreate it.
Oh, I see.
Based on
okay.
your complicated description.
Got it. Okay. Well, I hope the visual is better.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic.
We get
But
no
I just
credit for it. We had a designer do it for us. Anyway, keep going.
so I just had to draw my own line, and essentially the version of mine, I won't hold it up, is just a line that's inclined, and at one end it says predictability, the lower end, and the higher end says productivity. Um, and the interesting aspect of it is that there's this gravity that pulls the slider down towards predictability. So, and I thought, oh, that sounds very familiar. That's something I've talked about before. This kind of gravity is a great way of describing it. This kind of, it could also be an elastic that this kind of gets pulled back. Actually, we still, this organization, this manager, I still need you to be well. And I thought, oh, that's very interesting.
There you go. Okay. And so I'd say that gravity is the desire for control. So that manager in that situation is saying, hey, I want more control, so I want you to be more predictable. And the typical model for this, the kind of easy examples at each end, are that NASA, for example, produces hundreds of lines of code per year per developer. So an individual developer might write a couple of hundred lines. And if you write code at all, or if you've ever seen anybody who does it, that's an extraordinarily slow pace. But they have to be predictable, because Mars is only going to be wherever it is that moment. So they have to launch the rocket at exactly the right time. If they miss it, they have to wait another 7 years or 10 years or 100 years until the planet is in the right place again. So that's why it's super important for them to be predictable. It's a good thing. It's good that they can push the slider down in that direction. And a startup, a really early stage startup, is way up at the other end. They're super predictable, and they are super predictable because, or sorry, super productive, and they're productive because they're not predictable at all. They come in the morning and they say, hey, we got this cool idea from this customer, and we only have 2 customers anyway, so let's go do what they said. So maybe we can get 4 tomorrow. And so they're extremely fast-paced and productive, but nobody can tell what they're going to do. And nobody cares because they're not big yet. When they get big, they suddenly start getting that desire for control, and that starts pushing them down toward predictability. The danger is that you can get pushed down toward predictability when it actually doesn't make sense. And that's when the desire for control is counterproductive, because what could be much more productive and helpful for you is to be less predictable, to not get not have as much control, but to have more output. And that's a very hard balance for people to see, because they often want to get themselves operating at what they think is a bigger and more scalable level. And so they'll say, oh, I need those agile processes. I need to make sure I know all about when the team's going to finish this. I need to give them an artificial deadline. That's a very dangerous thing to do. And I'll give them this deadline, and then they'll produce. And that's how we'll get to be better. And it doesn't work like that, because there's a trade-off between being more predictable and being more productive. And if you push them toward being more predictable, people will do it if that's what you press them to do. The problem is they will become less productive. And then you say, hey, I hired more people and I got less done. How the heck did that happen? And the answer is probably that you pushed them toward greater predictability. But you have a really interesting question about this. When you wrote me with it, Jamie, I said, I got to talk more about that. Let's get Jamie on. So what's your question? What could we deal with?
Well, going back to the podcast, it was the interesting discussion. It was fleetingly you both mentioned, in Agile we would prefer ways of being predictable, but that are lightweight. So I think one of you said first said lightweight, and then later on cheap was the other word.
Yeah.
So I could think of lots. So I went to thinking, what are the techniques that could increase predictability? And I could think of quite a lot, but I kept going, well, I don't think that's cheap. That would be very difficult for this organization I have in mind to do. So that wouldn't be cheap. That wouldn't be lightweight. And so it intrigued me. I think it was almost, I know you didn't intend this to be this way, but it's like you teased it in the episode and then didn't elaborate on it. It's like, ooh, and it just, it's always good when you read something or you hear something that makes you think. And yeah, I was really struggling to think, well, what is it that makes it more predictable, but it is lightweight and or cheap? Hence, that was my question I threw to you.
There you go. Sounds good. So let's think about a couple of those. So I'll do an easy one first, and I'll contrast a heavyweight activity with a lightweight activity. And the nice one about this example is it's pretty standard in the literature, so you can just go search it on Google or Instagram if you want, and you'll see examples of these. And they're very closely aligned these two techniques, but one tends to wind up being heavier, again, because of that desire for control, and one tends to be considerably lighter. And the two ideas here are things called burn up charts and burn down charts. And if you've ever seen these, I'm not going to try to draw them because I'm not a good enough artist, and I should get myself an easel or something here. But a burn down chart, as you can imagine, burns down. So you're seeing that you have this much work to do, and then you start doing some of the work, and it keeps going down. And I'm going to run out of space on the screen here, but it keeps going down to a certain level, and it's a graph that lets you then extrapolate. So you might get down to here, and then you do a dotted line that goes down over here, and you say, gosh, that's when we're finished. We know that if we continue at the current pace of completing the work that we have in front of us, then we will be done on July the 23rd or whatever it is. And you can say, well, we hope to be done by July the 30th. Great, we're on track. Or we hope to be done on June the 1st. Wait a minute, we're way off track. And it gives you a lot of information about what you're currently doing. And that is a method of then auto-correcting, of making corrections in your Agile team and your Agile activities that then help you to be more productive, because you should be able to then adjust to bring the date in line. And my favorite way, of course, is to reduce scope, which is what people never want to do. They always want to somehow make developers type faster, and that never works. So I won't go into that unless you ask me about it, Jamie, or unless listeners do. So feel free, folks who are listening, to throw questions in the comments. We should see them here if this is all working as it should, and we can answer them. At any rate, so that's a burn down chart. And that's the one that actually I find tends to be heavier weight for a reason that maybe you can guess, but I'll explain in a second. And then the other one is a burn up chart, which is exactly like the burn down chart, except you go upwards. And if you think about that for a second, that should seem strange, because you're starting with no work, which means no work has been done. So you have to kind of flip your idea around. So how much work have we done? We've done none. We're at the x-axis. And then we do a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And we say, yeah, and we're going to finish over. Well, where do we go to finish? And that's the difference, is that instead of finishing at zero work, which is the burn down method, you finish at a certain amount of work that you've defined, and you can change it. So what happens is you wind up with two lines. You've got a line that's kind of coming up like this. It's going up toward the right. And then you've got another line that's going across. And if it were perfect, if the world never changed and you always did all the same things all the time, then your line would be perfectly straight. But Jamie, you've worked in Agile teams. Does it ever happen that the amount of work remains the same in any period? Have you ever had that happen?
No, and we embrace that.
Yes, and this method embraces it, and it's one of the things that makes it a lighter touch, because you say, well, look, I can change that line. So if somebody discovers a new thing to do, we add it, and then our line goes up. That means we're further behind now, because suddenly we made more work for ourselves. We couldn't do that with the x-axis. Your math teacher would get in a lot of get upset with you if you started moving the x-axis. You're not allowed to do that. But here you can move this line that you've put in, so you can move it up. And of course, you also, this happens much less commonly, but sometimes you discover you don't have to do something. And you discover a shortcut, or you discover something isn't important, or people already have it, and therefore the line goes down. Then you're ahead, you're further ahead, you're getting better. So you get a line that kind of goes up and down and across, and then you get one that's coming up, hopefully to meet it at some point. And you can then draw the point where those two meet, and you can say, yeah, on our current workload that we currently know about, if that were to continue in a straight line, we would be finishing here. You can also do clever things and try to predict how much the work will grow. I'm not too fussed about that. That would be more heavyweight to be trying to do that level of predictiveness. So the reason that I look at these two and say the burn up is a lighter weight is not so much about the process of drawing it. The Jira will draw these things for you if you want, if you're using that, both that kind of love-hate relationship tool that some of us are burdened with. So you can get computers to do this for you. I've seen people do it in Excel and other places. What's more interesting is what behavior it leads to for you. So the behavior with the burn down chart tends to be, as I was alluding to before, that you think of kind of static things that you can do. And those tend to be harder to come up with, because you think to yourself, well, the amount of work is fixed. Now what do I do? And that's a hard problem. Whereas if you're working, and it's Jamie, you might be able to do that in your team, because you're working to coach them, and you're in the team, and you're helping them all day. But somebody outside the team might, if they look at a burn down chart, say, well, we've got this fixed amount of work. What we need to do is add more people. And if you go back and read a book that my father had called The Mythical Man Month, you will discover that if you add more people to a late software project, it gets later. And so that tends to be a terrible idea, and that doesn't work because they try to add more so they can get it done faster. That almost never works, right? Or the other thing they say is we should skip those pesky unit tests, or we should get the developers to type faster and stuff like that. And that tends to be very counterproductive and heavyweight because it's very distracting to the team to be dealing with those kinds of demands. But it's very natural because the tool tells you to look for that. On the other hand, a burn-up chart makes it very clear that the amount of work can change. And that's the one that's usually the most productive and helpful to look at. So what I tend to tell people to do is do a burn-up chart. It'll lead you to the right kind of solutions, and then use it the right way and look for things that reduce the amount of work. So try to bring that line down when you're going too slowly. So that's one technique. So again, invite listeners and folks who are paying attention to us, who have us on their screens, please comment. But I'll ask Jamie, does that make sense to you?
It does. But can I interrupt with a leading question? So
please, I would love it.
So what are you burning up here? Are you burning up story points?
Very good point. So you can measure this in all kinds of different ways. My favorite way to, actually, I have two favorite ways to measure, and I'm going to come last to my lightest weight technique, which is actually my favorite one. So I'm saving the best for last year. But if you're not operating in that particular way that we'll come to in a moment, then my favorite way to measure is just to measure all tickets as the same. So I just count all tickets the same number. Now, I'm quite radical in that way, that I would say, look, everything's the same. We can measure every story as the same size. That's evidently not true. The problem is everything else that you might do is also evidently not true. So human beings are terrible at estimating complex knowledge work they've never done before. Pretty good at handling, say, building a brick wall and counting the number of bricks I put up in the last hour, and then the number of bricks I'm going to put up in the next hour is probably the same. Putting up bricks is kind of the same behavior. Building a login screen is completely different from building a new algorithm, is completely different from building a data engineering pipeline, etc. These things are so different, and even building one of them is very different from building the next one, because every circumstance, every environment is so different. So all the estimation that people spend huge amounts of time doing and holding grooming sessions. I have someone I was doing due diligence for. They have a pre-grooming, a grooming, and a post-grooming. I'm not sure what all those do, but they were getting very detailed estimates for everything they were doing, really way down on the predictability slider, which was good for them. So they wanted to be super predictable. They did not want to be super productive. And that was fine for them. I'm not objecting. But I'm not sure all that estimation was really producing high fidelity information. Maybe it was, but I wouldn't hold my breath. So my favorite thing to measure is just count the number of tickets, and it averages out about as good as any estimation that you might spend, getting your planning poker cards out and counting them out and getting all kinds of numbers and figures and saying this is a 4.2 and that's a 7.9. So that's my favorite way. But if you want to use story points, you can. And I would be okay with that. There's quite a lot of danger in using story points because people forget what they're supposed to be. So if you go read books, modern books about story points and Scrum processes and all these wonderful things, then the problem is that those techniques are all kind of project management. And so they're trying to measure, and I've seen teams try to measure in number of hours, number of minutes, number of days. They have a mapping between their story points and their number of days, and it's very unhealthy and very rigid, and again, heavyweight, because you get this huge process and you get trying to correct your velocity so it matches the number of days and a whole lot of other stuff. Stop doing all that stuff because it just doesn't help you very much. If you want to use story points, use them the way that they were originally intended. And you can go back to books like Extreme Programming Explained by Kent Beck. There are 2 editions, by the way, both of which I think cover this very well, but very differently, because he essentially rewrote the book and called it a second edition. Either edition you read, and there's a number of those other old books from that time, say that story points should evolve with the team. And they are a measure that really only makes sense to the team. It's to help the team understand what it's done previously. And so a story point in Team A is completely unrelated to a story point in Team B. And a story point in Team A in June may be completely different from a story point for a team in December. The problem is it drives project managers absolutely around the bend. Project managers, folks who want to think about Gantt charts and so on. Very valuable people who tend to think in hours and days and do a tremendous job of doing that, kind of down at that predictability end of the predictability productivity tilted slider. But the problem is that it doesn't map, because if you use story points the correct way, you let the team evolve a definition of what a story point is for them. And that may be very different from what somebody else does. If you use them correctly, they can be at least reasonable as a measure. And what you wind up with is this concept of velocity, which Beck again very nicely describes as being like yesterday's weather. So Jamie, what do you think the weather's going to be like tomorrow?
Pretty much like it was today.
Exactly. You've exactly. Yes. Well, we're in England, so it's winter, so it's probably going to be kind of gray, and it's going to be rainy, and that's a reasonable prediction based on that was kind of how it was today. Now, if you woke up tomorrow and there were rainbows and sunshine, and everything was beautiful and unicorns and summery, that would be very surprising. It might happen, but it's not terribly likely in November. So a very good predictor of what's going to happen tomorrow is what happened today, and story points give you a measurement of what happened today and a way of saying, well, my velocity is probably going to be the same. The problem is, again, that we got in this kind of predictability mode, that desire for control, and we've had some people join us, so I'm gonna put up the tilted slider again so they know what I'm talking about. This is my very high-tech visual aid here called holding up the book Agile Conversations, which I wrote with Jeffrey Frederick, and then having everybody look at the picture. So people would like to be at that productivity end of the slider, but they keep getting pulled down by their desire for control, and that puts them down at the predictability end. And that's what can cause them a lot of difficulty, as we were noting before. And if you're kind of at more of the predictability end than you need to be, if your situation isn't one where you need to be like NASA and super predictable, then you may wind up trying to do detailed measurements of your velocity and discovering exactly how much time you spent in every sprint on everything, and trying to do kind of time and motion studies to optimize. And then you're using story points completely the wrong way, and it's very heavyweight. And yeah, it can improve your productivity. I'm sure that you could help yourself to be more productive by measuring how, helping every developer to learn to type faster. The improvement would be minuscule. I'd strongly recommend that instead you do something much more lightweight, measure using a burn-up chart, for example, and the number of tickets, and that is much more likely to get you to a good result faster. So there's that idea. So now we've covered story points and burn up and burn down charts as two of the answers. I've got another answer to Jamie's question, which for late joining listeners is what do we do in order to have lightweight methods of being both predictable and productive? And we've talked about a couple of those. Does that make sense to you, Jamie? And also, listeners, please feel free to make comments on Facebook or YouTube. We should see them here, and we should be able to answer if you have questions or thoughts. Jamie, making sense to you so far?
Yeah.
Anybody? Yeah. Anything confusing?
It's making sense. It's all sounding very familiar. So
okay, yes, fantastic, good. Well, now I'm going to say something that's probably not very familiar. How much have you done with the notion of Carpaccio? Do you even know what Carpaccio is?
Yes, I do. I do know this one. I'm an Agile coach, of course.
Okay, all right. But lots of people don't. So help us out.
So yes,
what is Carpaccio? And I haven't said anything about which type of Carpaccio yet. But what's Carpaccio?
It's as I understand it, it's very thinly sliced meat.
Exactly. Now, I'm a vegetarian, so the unfortunate thing is that this is a very unpleasant analogy for me. I don't mind killing animals. I'm not that kind of vegetarian, but I don't know much about meat, and I haven't eaten it for 30 years. But like you, I understand that if you pick up a piece of Carpaccio and you hold it up, I could still see you, Jamie, through the Carpaccio if I were holding it here in front of the camera, because it's so thin you can see through it. And so a very clever guy named Alistair Cockburn, spelled Cockburn, and the CK is silent for some reasons you can imagine. And Mr. Cockburn, signatory of the Agile Manifesto, thinking about this stuff while some of us were still in diapers, very, very clever person with huge amount of experience, wanted to explain what he could do. And I'm not going to explain how one might do this particular thing. He comes to a team, he joins it, he gets to know the team a little bit, and he makes a valuable contribution every hour. So in an hour, he can make a fully, from writing the code to actually getting it live, a piece of value to customers. Now, it's extremely thin. You can imagine how much that value is. It's a tiny, tiny piece of value, but it's done in a very, very rapid way. And he wanted to explain how he does that. And if you want to hear about that, go find Coburn and get him to tell you, because I'm not going to tell you that. I'm going to tell you a variation on this elephant Carpaccio that's valuable for exactly this problem of being super predictable and super productive. But this doesn't go quite as far as him, because I'm not him. But the notion he had in explaining it is still valid for both his idea and for what I'm going to describe. He said, look, imagine your project is an elephant. And now imagine that you're going to be slicing your elephant into pieces. It sounds very unpleasant to the elephant. I'm vegetarian, sorry, I can't help it. And you're going to slice it into these tiny, tiny slices that are so thin you can see through them. And you slice this project that you're working on, this big epic that you're working on, into pieces. Now, you could slice it one of two ways. You could slice it horizontally. And the pieces you would get, well, the first piece you'd get would be a bunch of feet. There'd be 4 different feet, right? And then the next piece might include some of the belly, and the next one would have some of the trunk. It would just look like a bunch of circles or ovals or something. It would not at any point look like the silhouette of an elephant. And he says, so that's what you do when you say, oh, I know how I'm going to slice up this story that I'm working on. I'm going to have the database layer. I'm going to build the database tables. Then I'm going to build the validation. Then I'm going to build the stored procedures. Then I'm going to build the API, and so on. You build it all the way up from the bottom of the stack to the top. Or the other way around, you start at the user interface and you go downward. Whichever way you do it, you wind up with a whole bunch of pieces, none of which look like your ultimate project. And when your stakeholder, your customer, or somebody who cares about your product comes along and says, hey, what did you do yesterday, Jamie? Then what you say is, I built a database table. And they say, can I see it? And you say, well, no. And they say, well, what are you doing tomorrow? Well, I'm building an API. Can I see it? Well, no. When can I see it? Well, when it makes its way into the app. And they say, okay, I'll come back in a month. Then they don't have this feeling of tremendous productivity and progress, which is not what we're looking for. And that's not what Alistair was trying to describe. So he said, don't do that. Don't slice your elephant horizontally. Instead, slice your elephant vertically. So if you slice an elephant vertically, you might miss the ear, or you might miss the trunk as part of it, but you're going to get kind of an elephant-shaped thing all the way along. Every piece, every slice that you work on that's so thin you can see through it will be kind of elephant-shaped. And that's the idea of doing elephant Carpaccio for your team. So what I teach people to do, I'm working with a client on this right now, is helping them to figure out whether it fits for them and adopting this notion of elephant Carpaccio. What I say is every developer should have a task which they estimate as 1 day or less to complete. And complete means get all the way to live, so real customers can actually see it. In some environments, you're shipping the code in some complicated way. It's on premise and so on, and so you can't actually ship it. Okay, fine. But you can get it live to internal customers. But it's got to be all the way live. You can't cheat and say it only works on my machine. It has to be really live. And ideally, it's in a browser that somebody can use. It's on somebody's app. Real users can see it, even if it's behind a feature flag. So every developer releases a new thing every single day that gives value. And that's enough slicing for me. To get Coburn if you want to know how to do it every hour. But every day produces tremendous results. So one of the first things you do is you can skip all that grooming. So you don't have to do any of that estimation up front and go and say, gosh, I wonder, how many points is this one? You're going to play your card and say it's a 13. I say it's a 5. Let's go argue about it. What you do is you slice up the work into 1 day pieces, and then you count the pieces. And of course, this also makes, as we were talking about before, the burn-up chart very easy to maintain, because you count the number of slices, whatever method you're using to track those. And then you know how long it's going to take. I bet you're already thinking, wait, there's something that's going to go wrong with this. Yes, there is. So hold that thought. Let me finish explaining, but then I'll say what to do when your estimation turns out to be wrong. Because as I was saying before, your estimation is going to be wrong. That'll happen in elephant Carpaccio just the same. But the difference is that then what you're going to get is a very easy way to tell whether you're on track for any given project and to show progress on it. And so it's kind of like the clever trick. I don't know, Jamie, if you've heard this story before, and I actually don't know if it's true, but it really seems like it should be. One of the reasons, there's a particular reason that sometimes when you go to lifts in buildings, you remember when we could go to buildings, right? We're all stuck in our houses that don't have lifts in them, but Americans call them elevators. We call them lifts. When you go to a building that's tall and it has a lift in it, there's often a mirror there. And there's an old story about why this is. Have you heard this story?
I have, yes.
So what's the reason for anybody who hasn't heard it?
So this is one of the Russ Ascot tales, I think.
I don't know. I've heard it many places.
Oh, okay. So, okay, let me see if I can get the story right then. So there was the company. There were a law firm or something. They were on one of the higher floors, and there were complaints that they couldn't get people coming up the up the lift elevator quickly enough. People were waiting, 2-3 minutes, and they got the whole company together and they said, "Look, let's brainstorm this. What's the?" Well, I think maybe before that they got the experts in and they said, we can't put extra elevators in because it's an
Let's
old
put faster
building.
lifts in, faster motors, but then people will get whiplash, and we can't go that fast. Yeah.
So yeah, so they got the whole company through, gathered everyone in the company, and it was a young boy or something, office boy put his hand up. So I got this idea, I don't know, where all ideas are welcome. And then the story goes that, and in 1 week's time they'd implemented it and the problem was solved.
By putting up mirrors so that people will be entertained. They'll have the other, you can look at the other people, you can do your hair, you can do all kinds of different things
I think the clincher was that that people would look at other people without being seen to look at other people.
Yes, exactly. So you can sneakily kind of look over there and say, "Oh, what's that person doing?" Oh boy, I wonder what that was happening there. It's entertaining enough that you
the wait time, but they kept people entertained, so they didn't notice the wait anymore.
Exactly. And so Elephant Carpaccio works in a similar way, but in a kind of more upfront way. So it's less sneaky than the mirror, because what happens is that people see the progress, and so it doesn't feel like you're going slowly at all. Because one of the two things that I often get as objections to this, and I'm going to see if Jamie can figure out the other one. I bet you have already. One of the objections is, hey, wait a minute, if I stop to make sure that I release something every time, even if we get our releases really fast, which we certainly should, we can get them fully automated and fully tested in unit tests and integration tests and so on. So the release process isn't effortful. I'm going to have to stop. I'm going to have to build like my database and my front end at the same time. That's going to be really challenging. How the heck am I going to do that? I'm going to be slower. Because if you'd let me build the database table and get that right, and then get the API right, and then get the front end right, if I could do that, it would take me 4 days. And if you want me to do this other thing, it might take me 6 or 7. You really want me? I thought you said this is going to help you be more productive. The thing is that it helps you be more productive in 2 ways. Number one, it makes sure that people have the kind of mirror effect of, hey, there's a thing here. I can go play with this. And they can also tell you, I've just gone and played with this. And Jamie, this is completely wrong. Stop. This is the wrong thing. You're building you're something that isn't helpful. And typically what you wind up saving is an awful lot more on the, hey, wait a minute, this isn't right. Or, hey, I've got a better way to do it. The feedback that you get after 1 or 2 days of actual released code. You save an awful lot on that because you cut out weeks or months of work that you didn't have to do and that was going to be negative value anyway. And you save more on that than you pay in the extra cost to make sure that something comes out every day. So that may be hard to believe, but I've seen it happen over and over again if done well.
It's an interesting point you raised there, because I've also got another slider in my arsenal of
great graphics. What's that?
And on one end of the scale it says, let me get this right, efficient, and on the other end it says effective. And the effective one is the one in the air, and there's this gravity that seems to pull it down, so that I've gone into a client and I said before, what we're going to do is we're not going to be efficient anymore. We're going to be purposely inefficient about some things. And even written up on the board, traditional methods are efficient for this reason, but we're going to be inefficient because we want to be effective. And right. So describing the same thing is that kind of, if we have to do something that's a bit slower, but it means we get the feedback quicker, then we'll do that. And
because
so
we'll actually go to the correct destination. I often say we're trying to go very, very fast and we're going the wrong way. So we will get where we're going slower because we're going extremely fast in west when we'd like to go north. And what we need to do is go the correct direction.
Yeah, it's got this similarity because there seems to be this gravity, this kind of, I don't know what it is, traditional practices, the way the organization has always worked, that kind of brings it back down to kind of, well, I've looked around and, this database guy, on the Thursdays and Fridays, he's just sitting around doing nothing. This is much more inefficient. Shouldn't we get him doing something?
Yep.
And you think, well, okay, you have to explain. Well, and this goes into another part of the predictability product. A really important point you made in the podcast is that the slider only controls the input. it doesn't control anything else, and it doesn't matter. You choose where you set it, and gravity might pull it back down in one direction. But where you set it, it does not mean that's the effect you're going to get. You can still set it to be more productive or be more predictive, and you can still be ineffective and get no results,
exactly.
or poor results.
Because you might be super productive, but in the wrong direction. So I really like you've expanded the family of sliders. Maybe we'll have a whole family of them at some point. So that's one of the difficulties that you can wind up with, is that people say, well, wait a minute, you're actually being less effective here because you're getting less done. You're being less efficient. Sorry, I said it wrong. You're being less efficient because the work that you're doing every time to get something done for every day is slower. You're taking time to do something so that it can be visible, and then you're going to undo it the next day, and then you're going to undo what you did that day in order to keep the engine moving along. Why are you doing that? You're doing that because you can get much better feedback, and you can keep yourself going the correct direction. So that's one of the lightweight methods. And when I say it's lightweight, I usually find that I can teach people how to do this in about an hour, and it takes them about a week to be proficient at it. So that's the amount of input that you need to get in order to be good at this. This is not a method that takes huge amounts of certifications and fancy tools and something else in order to be good at it. It turns out that actually developers are really good at slicing things into small pieces. They just don't believe it. It's overcoming the mental set of like, wait a minute. You want me to do it so that it's visible every day? Well, I know how I do that, and they can usually give me back pretty quickly what those steps are. But they just kind of don't believe that anybody would let them do it. The results usually are very positive. So I'm wondering if Jamie can guess. And by the way, listeners, by all means, feel free to make comments, interact, ask us questions. Doesn't matter what it's about. Always happy to help. This is open office hours, after all, to be helpful on anything. Jamie, I'm wondering if you can guess, because I've actually forgotten. I'm going to try to remember it. But we were talking before about some objections, and I was alluding to two objections. One is, hey, wait a minute, this thing's going to be slower. You're going to get this stuff done less quickly. So we dealt with that one. Can you guess or help me remember what the other one is? What do people say? What would you say if you were confronting this, or maybe you've introduced it for your clients? What do people object? I'm putting you on the spot. Sorry.
Absolutely. I can't. My mind's gone blank.
And I have the same feeling. So let's not worry about it. Anyway, did I answer your question? So I gave you 3 different methods so far, and I'm happy to think up more and to answer more questions from the chat. The answer number 1 was use a burn-up chart, and it's even better than a burn-down chart for tracking your productivity and guiding you toward the right kinds of things. Don't use story points. Count the number of tickets. Make it a very simple process for understanding where you are, and then do Elephant Carpaccio, so you actually release a new thing for every developer every day, so you're seeing the progress. Did that answer your question? Did I miss something there? Do you have follow-ons from that?
It did, yeah. Can I just follow up on the last one?
Yeah, please, of course.
So what I've heard you say is that you can talk to developers and introduce the topic of splitting their work so that they get a developer to do something within a day.
Something valuable released to production.
Real
users can see it.
And released to live. Now, from my experience, that organizations and teams find that quite difficult to do in practice. They might have dependencies on other teams. They might have a process that takes a long time. They might have to, pass it over for UAT that takes a week, and that person's not available all the time. And they do actually find that very difficult to do. So again,
and those are real productivity barriers. So you're describing a whole bunch of things that would keep a team from being more predictive, more productive. They would keep them. It's part of the force of gravity. All of those things are methods of control, which may be useful in some cases, but they are real productivity barriers. Can't argue.
So what I'll tell you what. Here's a clue of something I'm looking at right now.
Oh yeah, fantastic, excellent.
I've been trying to follow this because.
Excellent.
Because I'm slightly out of alignment, and I need lots of practice with this tool. the ladder inference. As I'm sorry of a line, because in my experience, people find that very difficult to get to that point where they can release something to live within a week, because of their existing
or within a day, which is what I've just demanded. So doing it within a week is difficult for them, and I come along and say, let's do it in a day. It actually sometimes can be easier to get people to think about how they could do something in a day than a week, because a week kind of feels close to what they're doing. They might be releasing every month, and so a week feels like they could just do something that's a variation of what they're doing. If you say a day to them, they say, oh my God, if I were going to do that, I'd have to do this. And you say, wait a minute, say that again more slowly. And then you go and try and figure out what that is. I agree that that's challenging in a lot of environments. But the reason it's challenging is exactly the reasons that are holding back the productivity that you'd like to have. So things like, we have to wait for UAT is a productivity barrier. Now, maybe you have a really good reason for having that level of predictability, because you're going to make sure that everything's very safe. You're reducing risk a lot. You're making sure that somebody is doing this user acceptance testing, verifying that your code is working exactly the way that it's supposed to, and that users are satisfied with it. Great, but just don't expect to be very high on the slider, right? So don't expect to be up toward productivity, and expect it to be heavyweight. If you would like to change that, then one way to change it is to introduce pressures that tend to reverse the flow of gravity, right? That say, let's push this slider upward. And you say, hey, wait a minute, we could go live. The thing that's holding us back is this desire to reduce risk. How much risk are we really having if we have feature flags, if we release a beta version, if we do other things that kind of limit the risk? Would that be a good substitute, which would allow us to get to the elephant Carpaccio goal of releasing every developer every day? Would that be valuable? It might or might not. There might be an organizational barrier that means that organization is not going to be able to let you get that far, in which case you can do other proxies, right? So you can do a release that happens to that goes to a proxy environment, or goes to internal users, or something like that. It's not as good, but it can give you an awful lot of feedback and still be helpful for all the productivity and predictability gains that you get from something like Elephant Carpaccio. But you're absolutely right. Those things can be barriers, but they're barriers to any form of productivity. They're not. They're worse. A Carpaccio type method introduces them, makes them very visible, but that's a good thing in my experience.
Yep, that makes sense, and I'm glad I had that conversation with you, because it seems we are more aligned than I maybe thought. Yeah, would a way of describing it maybe just came to me while you were talking there. Maybe the slider in this circumstances is particularly small. It doesn't matter where you set it. Your productivity can never go terribly high.
Exactly, because somebody is limiting you and saying you have to be down here at the much more predictability end. Again, there are cases where that makes lots of sense. Let's do that when we're building nuclear power plants. I have one that's a few miles from me, and I hope that the people who build it were not doing daily experiments where they were saying, hey, I wonder what happens if we put the control rods in this way. Not a good idea, right? Most of us are not building nuclear power plants. Nobody's shooting at us. Nothing is safety critical. And most of the time you can do push yourself up the predictability slider. You have to give up some control, and you may have to give up some of those mechanisms that are holding you in place. Okay, I'm going to give one more shot for listeners to comment. Nobody has so far. That's fine. We've had a good number of you coming along. I hope you're getting value from this, and that these ideas are helpful. You can always get in touch with me if you go to conversationaltransformation.com or douglassquirrel.com. You'll find lots about me and ways to get in touch, so you can ask a question, maybe even be on here like Jamie is. Jamie, are there more questions you have? Have I fully answered your question about how to be both predictable and productive, given you some lightweight tools, or is there more you'd like to know?
No, it's covered it quite well. I do have more questions if you wanted to carry on speaking.
Why don't we try another question? We've got about 15 minutes of the booked time left. We'll stop when we run out, or when run out of time. Go ahead. Okay,
well, this is a bit of a loaded question. I know that yourself and Jeffrey are very interested in from the podcast. I know you're very interested in cognitive biases and things like that.
Yep.
My question to you: have you heard of the Bader Meinhof effect?
Oh, now this is a puzzle. Now Jeffrey is the one who's really good on theory, so this is where my instinct from the podcast is to go, now Jeffrey, tell us about the Bader Meinhof effect. Except I haven't got him, which is annoying. I should have him on call. So I've heard of it, but I don't remember it. So please remind us, and of course that'll help listeners too, who probably are like me, heard of it and don't remember it. What is it?
Of course, the in-joke is that you'll be hearing about it a lot now that I mentioned it.
Okay, now I'm remembering. Go ahead.
So yeah, it's the phenomenon where you think about buying a yellow car and then suddenly you see yellow cars everywhere.
Yep.
Um,
Or you
so
hear
yeah,
a
so
word on the radio and it's like a new word that you haven't heard, and then 5 people use it in the next day. Yep.
that's right. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I mentioned that in passing is because since we had the conversation earlier, and I knew that we'd be having this discussion today, suddenly I see in the things I'm reading, oh, that's that's about predictability and productivity. And so I just wanted to share something that I read in a book. It's a book called Kanban in Action, which
Nice.
seemed to be
Sounds
nothing to
like a
do
good
with
title.
yeah. And so it made the observation about stakeholders and their kind of inspection of teams, if that's the right way of putting it.
Sure.
So the first example of a stakeholder that only met the team that they asked to do work for them every 6 months, and in that circumstance they might ask for much more rigid plans. You need, and I'm only seeing 6 months, and
Exactly. When I
therefore
come back in 6 months, I want you to have done these 7 things and make sure they're exactly like this. Make sure there's lots of control.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And contrasting it with a stakeholder that meets their team twice a week and looks for things, just to have you done that thing by Wednesday, have you done it Friday, builds up trust, builds up more expectation. And so when one thing slips through, not done, it doesn't matter so much. The impact isn't as much.
Partly because you can correct, because you can come back on Thursday, having not seen it on Monday, and say, hang on, wait a minute, you're off track here. Let's do something different.
Yep, and I think it was the same book that used this analogy of the long distance train travel versus the metro system, and that if when you're traveling by train, you book your ticket well in advance, you probably shop around for the best price. When you come to catch the train, you probably check online to make sure it's running on time.
If you're late, you run to make it. Not that that's ever happened to me with a high-speed train from where I live down here in Folkestone. Yep.
Yeah, because if you're in Sweden, the train might only go once a week. You need to get there early to make sure you're on it because there's a high cost of missing the train.
Yep.
Contrasting with, when you get in the metro or the tube in London, you tend to not even check. You might check that it's running, but you just turn up, you pay as you turn up. If the train isn't there, you wait for the next one because the next one is going to be along in a few minutes.
Yep.
And it's the same kind of thing. It's because it's just set up to deliver more quickly and more frequently. I guess that's a way of increasing predictability, but it's a way of building that expectation, and that people therefore don't need to check on people so much.
Exactly. And elephant Carpaccio results in that. But other methods of frequent delivery, and the frequent meeting with a stakeholder is a perfect example. Those also tend to give you, kind of like the mirror in the lift example we were doing before, gives the people who are waiting for you something to do while they're waiting. And in fact, even more so than the mirror, it's actually a really productive thing, which is they can tell you where you are and give you a steer. One thing I often use for this one is I contrast 2 different ways of getting to Mars. If you wanted to get to Mars, first is you could wait for Elon Musk to build you a rocket, and then you could climb in his rocket, and he's going to point the rocket at Mars, and then he'll push the button, and you can kind of sit in the rocket. You just kind of wait, and eventually you'll get to Mars if he's pointed the rocket the right way. There's no opportunity to kind of change your mind along the way. You're going to Mars, and you're sure that you're going to get there. So you're very predictable. You could even do ballistics and so on to work out exactly what time of day you're going to arrive at Mars. But you can't do much flexibility. It's nothing that can change along the way. So that's the real world. That's the only thing we have that actually exists. The other version is the Starship. So imagine Starship, Enterprise, or any other science fiction spaceship, and all of them, because it's much more dramatic and it fits in the story better, all of them have the ability to say, hey, well, wait a minute, let's turn and let's go someplace else. Real rocket ships don't work that way, at least the ones we really have. But Captain Picard can say, oh, look, that planet over there looks really interesting. Helmsman, go, turn this way and go see that planet. So if you're on your way to Mars, you could say, oh, an interesting asteroid, let's stop over here. Hey, let's go to Venus instead. And I hear the weather's better. You can do something different as you go. And those are both valuable things. If you want to get to Mars as fast as you can, get in a rocket ship and just go, but you're not going to have any opportunity to change course. And if Mars becomes less interesting for some reason during the journey, you're stuck. You're going to be there for a couple months and you get to Mars. On the other hand, if you're in a Starship, you have all this flexibility. It may not be quite as fast, and it's certainly not as predictable, because you might get distracted by something along the way, but it will give you a lot more information as you go. They're both valid ways to get to Mars, but one is much more predictable than the other. One is much more flexible than the other. And people tend, for that desire for control, that gravity on the tilted slider, they tend to want to be in the controlled, predictable version. I don't know where you were going with that one, but I wanted to throw in that analogy. Did you have a question about that, or were you just sharing that useful idea of the 6 months versus the twice a week?
Yeah, just sharing it. That one of those things I kind of read this week that made me go, oh yes, that's on the topic. Another one that kind of I'd like to say that I dreamt this up myself, but it's something I read in another book called A Scrum Book about Scrum patterns.
Okay.
And stable teams is one of them. And I was like, yes, of course. So there are some organizations say this team is successful, it's brilliant. What we'll do is we'll take one person, we'll split the team up and we'll plant one person in all these new teams and we'll grow all these wonderful new teams, and then you don't get the same effect.
Exactly. Somehow it's not like infectious cells. You can't kind of break up the mass of infectious cells and give it to everybody and then they all have the infection. It's not contagious.
No, so the idea being, which I fully support, is that when you've got someone like the A team, who deliver results if you know where to find them, they're cross-functional, they get things done. You treasure that. You don't split them up, and you, as the organization, particularly gets to know how they can deliver. They know what that team's capacity is. They know what they can and can't do, and therefore that helps with predictability.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
so you keep them together, but the problem you have there, of course, is how to replicate it. And this is a problem, especially in larger organizations, is you say, yeah, I've got my A team, and I do have to know where to find them. And they are super productive, and they're even predictable, because when I go to them, I know I get great results. How do I get great results from everybody? And that's a bigger challenge. But the solution is not to break up the A team and send all of its members. Mr. T goes over here and somebody else goes over there. That doesn't work. So I agree on that not being the solution. I don't know that I have a perfect solution to the problem of how you replicate, but splitting up the team certainly doesn't seem exactly right.
Yeah, well, I would say that, on the subject of the A team, well, the fact they're cross-functional, they're quite small, they're left on their own to get things done. You give them the mission and they figure out how to do it. They might leave a mess, but no one dies. And yeah, they're based on the results, and they get things done quickly. So you can replicate that by going, let's not have those big plans. Let's not have that, big portfolio planning. Let's maybe have small cells of cross-functional teams that have been given the autonomy to get on and do things. But anyway, that's me on a soapbox now.
I could get on the same soapbox, so we would share it and be happy about it. And I think we could say more at another time on that, because I could think of some things that could go wrong with that. I'm going to do one. So I don't think we've had any comments or questions, which is fine. That happens sometimes. I hope people have got value from this. But Jamie, unless you have anything more burning on your mind, if I've been helpful to you, that was my main goal, was to help you out. And then if it's helpful to others on the recording or any place else or on this live stream, that's great too. Anything else you had that was burning on your mind?
No, that's all good.
Excellent.
Thanks for your time.
Sure. Well, no problem. I enjoy doing this. I used to answer people's questions when they asked me, and then I thought, maybe I could just share it. So I hope that's helpful to both you, Jamie, and to others. I've enjoyed it very much. Again, you can find me on DouglasSquirrel.com, on conversationaltransformation.com. If you want to read a bunch of the stuff that we talked about, that's the book Agile Conversations, if I can hold it up correctly, from IT Revolution, written with my good friend Jeffrey Frederick, and you can read a lot more about that. Excellent. I'm sure I'll be back again sometime. I like to come on Fridays. It's not reliable. It's kind of when people ask me questions. So if you have questions you'd like to be sitting where Jamie is, feel free to ask. And who knows, you could be on my next office hour. Excellent. Thanks, Jamie.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for watching. Take care. See you again next time.
Bye.
Bye now.